I'm making a copy of a figure from Raphael's School of Athens, the figure that is known as Heraclitus. It was supposed to also be a portrait of Michelangelo. And it was actually added at the end after Raphael finished the fresco. He chopped out the plaster and inserted the figure. And so I've actually put a bit of the stairs as the context like he would have been when Raphael painted him. And now I've plastered what I'm going to do today, which is paint essentially more or less what Raphael did in his first giornata or day's painting. He painted the head and the collar and the hand, and then I'm going to stop it down here and cut back. So I've transferred, I've plastered the wall or the panel here with 2 coats of an intonaco, so the finished coat of plaster, it's got 1-to-1 proportion lime to sand. I'm just going to let it dry for a little bit, and then I'm going to transfer the cartoon, which I'm going to do in 2 ways. One, by tracing it, and that's the method known as incisione, where it essentially makes a groove in the plaster. Then the other way, like I did for the synopia or the underpainting, I'm going to pounce a little bit through the cartoon, and it'll transfer a series of dots. And it'll give a sense of the 2 techniques that were in operation in Raphael's day. By later in the 16th century, almost everybody does incisione exclusively, and the pouncing method sort of disappears. So in painting, essentially the raw material here that I'm using are the pigments that are just pure powdered pigment, the basis for all paint materials, essentially, that in other cases always have some kind of a binder. So watercolor has gum arabic as a binder, oil paint can have linseed oil or walnut oil or some other kind of binding oil. For fresco, the critical thing is that the lime in the wall is actually the medium in a sense. I will brush these pigments on with just some water, typically mixing these just with water. Occasionally, and especially in the Tuscan fresco tradition, they used a little bit of lime water, so water that had a little bit of the lime putty in it, so it makes a kind of a thin, like a skim milk kind of consistency water that will actually dry the colors a little lighter. But they will bond especially well to the wall because essentially the colors are being painted with the same stuff that the wall is made of. So simple stuff, pure pigments. The pigments are earth tones by and large, or pigments that mostly come out of the ground. There are a handful of synthetic pigments that actually are even ancient. There's a blue that was known as Egyptian blue that the Egyptians used and was well known throughout the Roman Empire. Otherwise, for most of what I'm painting here is essentially all essentially earth pigments. I have raw sienna, natural sienna. I have burnt sienna. So when you take yellow raw sienna and you burn it, you get a kind of an orange. I have got raw umber, so it's essentially almost a color that refers to the idea of shadow, and it was used probably mostly for painting the architecture in Raphael's scene. So that's raw umber. It's a kind of a gray, greenish brown. When it gets burnt umber, it gets quite darker and a little redder, perhaps you might say, and more properly brown. I have Roman black earth, which is a rather warm, light black pigment, but that would have been used, I will probably use it for Michelangelo's hair. Reds this is a Rosso Ercolano, so Herculaneum red, there's Pozzuoli red, there are all kinds of hot reds that come from around Naples. I have Venetian red, so as it suggests, it was used, at least it certainly was popular in Venice, but it's similar to a lot of red oxides. Again, burnt sienna, and then I have the purple that I'm going to be using for Michelangelo's cloak, which is known as caput mortuum, deadhead. So like a fan of the Grateful Dead, caput mortuum, this is a pigment that was used for its, because it's essentially a natural purple oxide, or it's an iron oxide. But it is used essentially purely for Michelangelo's or Heraclitus's clothing in this particular case. His boots, which I'm not going to be painting, were probably almost pure burnt sienna. So I'm ready to paint. I've made myself a little test panel. I've tested out my colors. Raphael may or may not have had something like this. But at this point in the fresco of the School of Athens, he probably wasn't guessing anymore about the color of flesh tones. In this particular case, I'm trying out some colors. For the flesh tones, I'm going to be using raw sienna, a little bit of Venetian red, and then for some of the shadows, burnt sienna and burnt umber. These are my brushes. These are like the Platonic idea of a brush. These are the simplest, humblest, and probably almost unchanged since Raphael's time brushes that are still the traditional brushes used for fresco. It's basically a stick with bristles set around the point of the stick and then bound together with a wire or string of some kind. I mean, it doesn't get any simpler than this. And the reason that they're kind of a little rough and kind of humble like this is that you're basically painting on sandpaper. I mean, essentially you're painting on some sand and lime, and it's not the kind of thing that's going to be conducive to painting with fine sable brushes. You want to use relatively rough, crude brushes, and there are things about the technique that actually are facilitated by the brushes. For example, spreading the bristles, and especially working a little dry, you can get the kind of streaking that may exist in some of the shadows on the face of Heraclitus that we'll see, and I'll try to replicate that technique. So the painter's mantra, and it's kind of a modern painter's mantra, but it probably was true in Raphael's day as well, is always use a bigger brush than you think you need, because it's the tendency to always want to tighten up and get really kind of precise and sort of miniaturish. But Raphael's going to start large. He's going to start with blocking in broad areas of color and work down to the details. It's the nature of fresco painting that over the course of the day, the lime and the plaster changes. Early in the day, there's a lot of lime on the surface, very limey kind of surface. Wonderful to paint in. You've got a lot of essentially medium on the surface, and that medium allows you to blend colors, make softer transitions. As the day goes on and the plaster is drying, and it tends to dry more rapidly, progressively over the course of the day, later in the day, the plaster is going to be accepting the pigments more quickly, which means you'll have less time to blend and sort of soften the transitions. And it'll also then facilitate working more precisely, working with maybe more linear forms, his eyebrows, for example, some of the darker lines in the shadows. So kind of a delineation might happen later in the day. It's also the time when you probably add some of the brightest accents. So early in the day, you're modeling the kind of medium range of values. Later in the day, you're adding the darkest darks and the lightest lights and the finer level of detail. Now, my guess here is that, and I wasn't up there on the scaffolding with Raphael, so I'm guessing a little bit at what he did when he painted. And I'm guessing that in the shade side of his face, and it's really more shade than shadow, he actually painted a rather hot version of the flesh tone, and then overlaid a kind of a wash of shadow. That seems to be what's happening. So I'm going to do something like that here myself. Maybe a little orange. So it's the nature of fresco, and one of the great challenges of fresco, that you can't really correct or change your mind too much once you put some color down. Once you've applied color, it's already beginning to interact with the wall, and I can't really scrape it off or change my mind. So the thing about fresco is that it's a kind of commitment, and it requires a kind of confidence and a kind of pre-planning. That means that you don't really need to be inventing or experimenting too much on the wall. You shouldn't be, because if you don't like what you've done and you want to change your mind, you have to chip off the plaster and replaster it and start all over again. So unlike oil painting, which takes days to dry and you can wipe off at any time, with fresco, more or less what I've put down, I'm kind of stuck with. So I'm trying to be, reasonably cautious, because I am imitating Raphael and I'm guessing a little bit of what he did. But at the same time, I also have to live with essentially what I've painted and what I've put down. So I'm about 20 minutes into the painting. I've blocked in a lot. I've put down areas that allow me to judge values, darks and lights against each other. And even for Raphael, this would have been every time he was up there painting, for all the preparation with cartoons and whatever maybe color studies he had done, seeing it up on the wall in reality at full size is always a little bit of a novelty. And so every painting, you're essentially learning about it as you're actually doing it. So blocked in some of the undertones in the flesh, the values, just getting some of the value in the hair. It does seem to be that the bristles of his beard are painted over his collar, so I have to put the collar in first before I do the bristles. So I've got that. I'm going to take this down and eventually at the end of the day cut back here to the edge of his sleeve, his proper right arm, because Raphael paints all of that and the rest of him in the second day or giornata. So the first giornata is really more or less what I'm doing here. His head, just a little bit under his collar here, immediately at his breast. The hand, he would have done his other sleeve. I have just a little bit of it here. And then at the end of the day, again, I'm going to basically cut that away so I can match up to it if I did a second giornata. But at least that way we can see what it looks like in stages as the giornate happen, phase by phase. I've looked for areas within the shadows where I could block in some of the lighter, warmer undertones that are then going to be overridden by the darker shadows. He seems to have given Michelangelo long fingernails. His little pinky finger there on his proper left hand seems to actually have rather kind of scraggly fingernails extending forward. So that's another probably sure sign that this actually is Michelangelo, because he was not always good about hygiene when he was working particularly hard. So I'm going to continue blocking in this tunic, essentially. I'm always kind of judging this against the cartoon, against the values that I have here. So it's pretty light back there. There's a shadow actually here. It's a little bit of a highlight here at this edge. There's a crease in the drapery there. And then this is the essentially the edge of his sleeve, which I'll be waiting to do another day. So I'll try to hit that value. That's about that. I'm going to brush in essentially a kind of a medium value here, and then add the darker shadows on top. Now, one of the techniques that Michelangelo seems to have used on the Sistine ceiling, and it's certainly true that Raphael never saw Michelangelo painting, but neither did I. But I was up on the Sistine chapel scaffolding when they were doing the restoration around the Libyan Sibyl. And we learned up there that Michelangelo was probably alternating between a smaller brush, brushing in the colors, and then a large, fat, rather dry bristle brush that he would then use to dust out quickly. Especially earlier in the day, it's easier to do the harsher transitions, and so he could actually blend a little bit up on the wall. That was in a way that was allowing him to get some sort of subtlety and rather gentle transitions. And it's one of the miracles of the Sistine ceiling that Michelangelo, with this bold technique that he's using, is still able to get an incredible level of subtlety in blending of values. And so I'm going to essentially show you how to do that. And Raphael, again, didn't see him painting it, but he probably could figure it out for himself, knowing as much as he did about Fresco. So this is the kind of thing that you can't do later in the day. I can only do it now for the first few hours. Later in the day, that kind of subtle blending that I just did is actually not possible. So in watercolor, you're depending on the white of the paper to be your highlight, whereas in fresco, you can add white. So it's really more like gouache, essentially. And but you can paint in fresco in washes, in transparent tones, and build up subtle layers of wash. And it's actually, in that way, you can do many of the things you can do in watercolor. And because it dries reasonably quickly and more quickly later in the day, it allows you to come back in and add these layers of wash, within minutes. Sometimes, again, more minutes earlier in the day, fewer minutes later in the day. And so I was prepared for fresco painting by the experience of watercolor. That essentially watercolor gave me a lot of the tools that I needed. And then working in fresco has ultimately gotten me more interested in gouache, which is a lot closer to how fresco actually behaves. So I'm overpainting a little bit. I'm going to eventually cut this all back at the end of the day, but I'm overpainting so that it dries more slowly around the edge, and I can get a cleaner cut at the end of the day. This would be a lesson, my lesson in time management for our students is if you work really intensely at the beginning, you can relax at the end. And I would rather have the patience and time at the end to nuance something. And that means putting a lot of energy into the beginning rather than taking my time at the beginning and then having to so-called charrette at the end. I would much rather be able to, with some patience and perspective, fix it, make it as best as possible at the end, rather than just trying to get something on the wall as fast as possible because the plaster is about to dry. And I think the hair is an important. It's not that it's all that expressive at some level, although I do think it has this kind of slightly disheveled quality that again makes me think he's thinking of Michelangelo. But it is a value. It's the darkest thing, and so it's a value against which you have to judge all the other values, and everything else is going to look relatively dark or light compared to essentially how dark or light the hair is. So the reason I'm kind of going in now, even though I bet it was done fairly late, and I am a little, down the line in the process here. I think it's an important thing for me to be able to judge whether I've gotten the values right or not. One of the things I'm going to do at the very end is, because I think some of his strands of hair are dragged on top of the steps in the background, and that's already dry plaster. I'm going to, at the end, with the brush with a little bit of black and some lime water, paint on top of that already dry plaster, especially these kind of areas of hair that seem to sort of sprout out over there. And that'll give it a sense of transparency, like he's really in front of the steps. But I'm going to wait to do that at the end, just because it's a little bit kind of a last minute touch-up kind of thing and not essential. But otherwise, I'm trying to get the value here so that I can go back in and sort of calibrate the values everywhere else and make sure I've gotten them, about as right as possible. I'm trying to preserve the painterliness of the hair. Like you can see strands, you can see there are highlights, there are flecks of gray. So if this is Michelangelo, whoever it is, their hair has already begun to turn gray. This Michelangelo, he's 8 years older than Raphael. So if Raphael's about either 26 or 27 when he's painting this, Michelangelo's 34, 35. Maybe he was a little bit prematurely gray. It's one of the things about making a copy is, what Raphael did with a flick of his brush, I'm trying to do with the flick of my brush, but he did it instinctively and I'm doing it self-consciously, which means my flick isn't exactly like his flick. And so it has that flick-like quality, but it doesn't actually necessarily look exactly like I'm thinking about around this eye. The description of the eyelid, the brow, what you see a little bit of the eyeball itself is incredibly indicative and quick and sort of spontaneous. And I want to capture some of that feeling, but I also have to do it by imitation, which means I'm being more self-conscious about it than he would have been. So, trying to preserve some of the life in this thing without, or at least preserving some of the quality of what Raphael did and some of the technique without, making it an absolute one-for-one kind of copy. And that's the nature of copying, especially in fresco. If you're copying a Raphael oil painting, so much of Raphael's oils hide the evidence of his hand that in a way they're easier to copy because you don't have to worry that every brushstroke is going to count. In fact, you're probably going to try to suppress the brushstrokes. Whereas in fresco, the brushstrokes are the painting, and they count a lot, and they're idiosyncratic. They're they're the product of a spontaneous gesture, not kind of a slow process. I do think like Bramante, there's a way in which Bramante looks a lot like the figure in this print that Ingrid's talked a lot about. That's probably a self-portrait of Bramante, Mr. Perspective il Prospettivo, and his pose is very much based on that. But Raphael and Bramante were compatriots, friends. So no doubt he actually, had some time with Bramante and checked it. With Michelangelo, I doubt Michelangelo was going to sit for him. They were rivals at this point. So he's competition, so Michelangelo's not going to help him out. So that's why some people think this doesn't exactly look like Michelangelo, because he doesn't have Michelangelo's broken nose. And it may be just that it's a slightly stylized version, and it may be essentially painted from memory almost. It's like an idea about Michelangelo rather than a real portrait. And then there are other people in the painting who some people think are portraits. Ingrid thinks, and I'm sure she's right, Epicurus over there on his column with his book is probably Tommaso Fedro Ingirami, who's Julius's librarian. And he probably had something to do with the iconography of the painting. And again, he doesn't look exactly like Ingirami. Ingrid points out the fact that he was wall-eyed. He was a little kind of askew. So it's a bit of an idealized portrait, but it has some of his qualities. And that would have been, again, a case where, in fact, Raphael does actually paint a portrait of Ingirami. So he knew him well enough to have a portrait, to paint his portrait. The fact that Plato looks sort of like Leonardo da Vinci is one of those things that people can say either he's just kind of a generic old man, and Leonardo da Vinci when he was old looked like a generic old man, or it really is Leonardo, but whether, that big beard hides a lot, and whether Raphael really needed a session with him to paint him, or whether he could have just painted him from memory is a question. Now, Leonardo probably would have given him a hand. I don't think Leonardo felt competitive with Raphael in the same way that Michelangelo did. So Leonardo probably would have sat, if Raphael asked him to, he probably would have sat for him. Although, again, I don't think he really needed him to sit. And then there's all kinds of other people in this thing, which are, there's so much discussion about who all these people are, in terms of who they're supposed to represent, and whether they're also, in some cases or another, based on portraits. And he certainly looks thoughtful, kind of pensive. But the longer you look at his mouth, I almost detect a hint of a smile. Interesting and subtle. I mean, it may just be an accident. I mean, it doesn't take much, to hint at a smile. It's just, we're so hyper attentive to those things as human beings. We read each other's gestures so subtly that we can pick up a hint of a smile. But it would be nice if he did make him smiling because it would suggest that it's a more subtle understanding of Michelangelo, that he's not just a kind of a brooding, misanthropic kind of guy, but he actually has a heart, he has a sense of humor, he has a soul. And it would be nice to think that Raphael gave him a little bit of a hint of kind of humor and humanity that he might not otherwise have had.